Hi Wildcats, Mrs. Forrest here. I'm going to read more of Sound, starting with Chapter 2, A Day of Adventure. For 5 days the women and children would dig the precious camas roots and store them in woven baskets lined with bark and grass. The boys watched the horses and exercised the animals that would be raced by the men. Every afternoon, braves raced their fastest horses against those from other bands. Many bets were made on each race. Sound loved to watch the strong braves dressed in breechcloth and knee-high moccasins mount their horses and race off in a cloud of dust. Each rider leaned far forward over his horse's neck, urging his animal on to greater and greater speed. Horses would strain forward, every muscle flexing for more power and speed. The Nez Perce were the best horse breeders and the trainers of all Indian people that Lewis and Clark met in their great expedition from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. The Nez Perce used only the finest stallions to sire their herds. They had large herds with as many as 7 to 10 horses for every man, woman, and child. All children learned to ride almost as soon as they could sit up alone. Horses were traded with a white man for many things the Indians wanted. When the 3rd day of the festival came, 2 things happened that Sound would always remember. The Nez Perce people would talk about this day around their campfires for many years. As usual, Sound was up early and eager to climb the hillside to check the horses before it was time for the morning meal. A few women were uncovering the hot coals and adding wood to build the fire's flames. A few boys were out and on their way to check their horses. Sound moved up the hillside, through the trees and onto an open slope. He could see the horses grazing in the distance and below him. Some of the animals had moved up the hill in the early morning shade. Something seemed a little different to Sound as he walked farther along and up the ridge above the horses. He noticed that the horses below all moved quickly away from the hill. Something was wrong. As Sound neared a small clump of trees and bushes, he saw some movement below and to his left. There was an outcropping of rock at that spot. He hurried around the edge of the protruding rocks. Her mother was below her and separated from her by the steep rocks. They were desperately trying to get them back together. It didn't look like a serious problem. Colts and fillies were often separated from the mares for a short time, but they usually got back together quickly, and this mare was far from her colt. Sound watched for only a short time and decided he would circle around from above and move the filly back to her mother. Sound had taken only a few steps away from the trees when he saw a movement on a rock above the small horse. He looked more closely. It was a large mountain lion whose color helped it blend in with the rock. The big cat had seen the filly get separated from her mother and was moving in for the kill. Instantly, Sound started moving to a place right above the 2 animals. The lion did not see or hear the boy. The mountain lion was ready to spring upon the helpless filly. Sound had no weapon except the knife in his belt. He needed to think fast to help the small horse. Sound worked to loosen some medium-sized rocks. As he worked, the powerful cat sprang from his rock in a silent, graceful leap. Sound saw the mighty cat hit the filly and knock her down on the rocks. Quickly, Sound pushed 2 of the larger rocks down the hillside toward the fallen animals. The rolling rocks loosened other rocks, and a small avalanche started down the hill. In seconds, the falling rocks reached the mountain lion and the filly. Most of the rocks missed the animals by several feet. They did scare the cat away from the filly long enough for Sound to come slipping and sliding down the hill. On his way down, Sound grabbed a large stick. The filly had scrambled to her feet When the dust cleared, the mountain lion was again poised and ready to leap. Quickly, Sound stepped between the lion and the filly. He raised his stick and waved it wildly. The big cat snarled and pawed at the air in anger. All this time, the mother of the filly reared on her hind legs and neighed loudly. The mare kicked at the rocks on the ledge below, as if she wanted to climb the wall to save her young one. All this commotion attracted the attention of two boys who were riding their horses a good distance away. They hurried to a place where they could see what all the fuss was about. When they saw a small boy holding off a mountain lion with only a stick, they could hardly believe their eyes. Immediately, they started their horses running toward Sound. They hollered loudly as they rode at top speed. That was all it took to convince the lion that it was time to leave. The big cat scampered straight up the hill and disappeared into the trees. When the two older boys got to Sound, he had already checked the filly. He had suffered only a few cuts from the cat's sharp claws. The cuts on the filly's neck and back would heal. The two older boys still could not believe that this small boy had dared to take on a mountain lion with only a stick. Not knowing that Sound could not speak, the two boys started asking him questions, one right after another. With sign language that all Indian people understood, Sound told the boys that he could not speak. Then, with his hands, he told the boys exactly what had happened. As they talked, they walked the filly back to her anxious mother. The mare nuzzled the filly and began to lick the cuts on her neck and back. When the boys returned to the camp, the word spread quickly about the attack on the filly and how Sound had acted quickly and bravely to save the young horse's life. Old Chief Joseph greeted his young grandson warmly and repeatedly told him how proud he was of him. Many people came by to see the brave 6-year-old and said kind things to Sound. All the boys were told to watch for the lion's return. After what had happened to the cat, he probably would not be back soon. This was not the end of the excitement for the day. The same afternoon, Sound's father, Ollicott, was in a horse race that would be talked about at campfires for years to come. Sound was watching with great excitement as his father got ready for the big race. This would be one of the best races of the festival. Ollicott would be competing against the finest riders and fastest horses from all the other villages. Most of the other riders were sons of Nez Perce chiefs also. One chief was sure his son would win. He offered 6 fine horses as a bet on his son. Chief Joseph quickly agreed to match the bet and had 6 of his horses brought over. Many men had bets on his race. They offered horses buffalo hides, fine jewelry, knives, and feathers. Ollicott was a fine rider. His horse was one of the swiftest in the Wallowa herd of more than 3,000 horses. This long-legged stallion had won many races in the past. Ollicott would do his best to win this one too. The riders would travel once around a small hill on the east side of the Great Camas Prairie. The race would follow a well-worn road. The finish was in front of the main campfire area. Everyone would be waiting eagerly to see the leaders come racing in. The excited riders mounted their beautiful horses and began to bring the nervous animals up to the starting line. Sound watched his father skillfully guide his mount toward the start. He saw the muscles in his father's arms and legs strain as he rode into position. Ollicott's skin glistened in the sunlight as sweat poured from his body. A brave stood off to one side and in front of the tense riders. The man held up a long staff which was decorated with bright paint and dangling feathers. It seemed as if he held the staff up for a long time. The nervous horses pranced and threw their heads up and down. They strained forward, eager to begin running. Suddenly, the brave pulled the staff to the earth, and the race had begun. A great cloud of dust arose as the horses churning hooves dug in for a fast start. The riders urged their mounts on, trying to gain a good position early in the race. Many people moved to a higher ground for a better view of the race. When the dust cleared, Ollicott could be seen running fourth early in the race. He knew he could catch and pass the three leaders easily before the finish. He was watching the rider behind him very carefully. This was Two Moons, a great rider on a great stallion. He was the one to beat. Ollicott held his position, waiting for the right moment to pass the leaders. He must make his move before Two Moons could pass him, but not too soon, or his horse might tire before the finish and lose to Two Moons. The horses were running hard, with their riders leaning far over their necks. None of the first 6 racers was far from the leader. The riders had rounded the small hill and were making the long run back to the finish line when Ollicott decided to make his move. He had waited as long as he dared. Quickly, Ollicott pulled his horse to the outside to pass the 3 riders in front of him. Two Moons followed right on Ollicott's heels, and he was coming in fast. As Ollicott moved up alongside the horse running in 3rd place, he saw a terrible thing happen directly in front of him. The leading horse suddenly stumbled and fell to the ground. The rider sailed forward, hit the ground, and rolled over several times. It all happened so fast that Ollicott, Two Moons, and the other riders were past the fallen horse and rider in an instant. Ollicott just caught a glimpse of the face of the fallen man, a face covered with dirt and blood. Without another thought, Ollicott pulled his horse to the left and out of the race. The other racers rode on to the finish line. Ollicott rode back to the fallen rider. He lay unconscious and bleeding. Ollicott quickly covered an open wound on the man's scalp with his hands and pressed hard to stop the bleeding. The blood oozed from beneath his hands, but it had already started coming out more slowly. Ollicott looked up and saw help coming. He didn't notice Sound standing on a small knoll behind him, watching as his father gave aid to the injured man. Several people came up on horseback. Others came running to offer help and to see what had happened. A stretcher was hurriedly made from 2 long poles and a large hide. The hide was stretched between the poles and fastened tightly. As soon as Ollicott had stopped the bleeding, 4 strong braves carried the injured man on the stretcher to the camp. The man's wounds were cleaned and wrapped. Cold water was carefully poured over his head and face to revive him. He would recover from his injuries. The race was easily won by Two Moons, but when the people saw how Ollicott had stopped to save the injured rider, no bets were paid. Everyone knew that Ollicott had done a great thing. Ollicott never thought twice about finishing the race. He thought only of helping a friend who needed him. No race was more important than helping a person in great need. Old Chief Joseph was very proud of his son, and his grandson too, because of the brave deeds they had done that day. Sound was proud just to stand near his father and listen to the good words the people said to Ollicott after the race. The Nez Perce people admire a person who forgets himself and thinks of others first. This was the lesson the old blind chief had taught his children and grandchildren. At the campfire that night, many people spoke of the things that had happened on this 3rd day of the festival. These stories would be added to all the other great tales that would be told for years to come around campfires all over the Nez Perce lands. And that's the end of chapter 2.